Sea of Thieves has had a variety of PvE encounters in its rich and gorgeous sandbox. From the stomach-turning Kraken to the humble Skeleton Lord, Rare has added several bosses to the game since launch, all of varying quality. While most bosses are a catalyst for PvP in their various world events, one update brought the best boss fights we've seen for this game, at least mechanically speaking. Today we'll be going over that boss fight featured in the Ashen Winds update and how this could be improved and embellished on in the future, and all of the other awesome stuff that came in that update. Join me as we discuss the Ashen Lords and the legendary Ashen Winds update. Ashen Winds released on the 29th of July 2020 and acted as July and August's monthly updates for Sea of Thieves, and broke the monthly update cycle for Rare. See, starting in July 2019, we had a cycle of monthly updates up until this point, with an update every single month. After Ashen Winds, this started to fizzle out. However, let's just get into the main piece of content, the Ashen Winds world event. Off the back of the Haunted Shores update in which Flameheart summoned fleets of ghost ships to wage war across the Sea of Thieves, he reawakened the Ashen Lords. These, in the lore, are his most loyal lieutenants that were Skeleton Lords, but through further profane and arcane experiments, became weapons of mass destruction, and we encounter them in the Ashen Winds world event. You have Old Horatio, Captain Flameheart's shipwright, Captain Grimm, the architect of the forts that we see around the map, Red Ruth, Flameheart's weaponsmith who created the first cursed cannonballs, and lastly there was Warden Chi, who oversaw Flameheart's captives. It was great that Rare gave backstory for each of the Ashen Lords, so it felt like these folks meant business and had a history in the world of Sea of Thieves. The Ashen Winds world event introduced a new enemy type, but it also added new loot, a new tool for the sandbox, and new mechanics that we hadn't seen before. Sea of Thieves is pretty basic when it comes to PvE encounters. Most enemies, including bosses, were just a case of hitting it until it dies. Now I won't lie and say Ashen Lords aren't like that, but they are much more expansive in terms of interacting with the player. The Ashen Lords wield the power of fire, ash and volcanoes. Fire had been introduced 9 months before, and volcanoes in the Forsaken Shores update in September 2018, but neither of those were really on this scale. The Ashen Lords have 3 stages to their fight, where the battle essentially heats up. You'll know when an Ashen Lord changes phase when they stop attacking and go down on 1 knee to recover. All phases include 3 types of melee, a normal swipe, a back swipe to punish players who stand behind it, and a jumping swipe, where they lunge at the player in front of them. They have 2 boulder throw attacks. One is a small fast throw that is thrown directly, and the other is a large boulder lobbed in a high arc. Both of these can damage the ship and punish players who get too close, or even too far away. They also have a fire breath attack, with their bodies wreathed in flames and a flamethrower spurting out of their mouths. An Ashen Lord will be stationary during this, but will damage players who get too close, even if you're not in the path of the flamethrower. The shockwave also returns, this one being much more powerful and can set players on fire within a certain range. It also damages masts, capstans and wheels of ships, unlike the old Skeleton Lord version. We're still going. The Ashen Lords can even cast a thick cloud of ash, making visibility basically nil. Finally, the World's End attack usually happens at the start of Phase 3, where the Ashen Lords turn the island they inhabit into a mini volcanic eruption. Boulders fall from a cloud in the sky, geysers flow from beneath the floor, and the Ashen Lord is wreathed in fire. These boulders will also hit and can damage the ship. Some of these attacks, like summoning skeletons and an area of effect blast, were similar to the previous Skeleton Lord fights, but most of the attacks are new or repurposed mechanics. When the Ashen Winds update dropped, their health was massive, leading it to be nerfed very shortly after release. At most, PvE in Sea of Thieves is relatively simple. The Ashen Lords force players to approach these world events differently. Using your ship as a safe haven was no longer an option, nor was being able to cheese the AI like the Skeleton Captains and the Skeleton Lords. It's a bit simpler to do nowadays because we have more game sense, but I'll get into that later on. To be fair to Rare, when they released this world event, they did also make sure the loot was really good. Ashen items would be left behind upon the Ashen Lord's defeat. These have a 50% gold and reputation buff compared to their normal counterparts. But most excitingly, the Ashen Lord's skull drops and is a usable weapon. It's a flamethrower that can damage players, AI and set fire to ships. It's quite weak when used as a means of killing other players, but is amazing for taking out skeletons. It does, however, decrease in gold value the longer you use it. This was yet another time we had a sandbox tool as a reward for finishing a world event, like the Stronghold Keg for the Skeleton Forts, and the Wraith Cannibals for the Flameheart Fleet event, and that was actually the last world event to do that. To this day, Ashen Lords are the most fun boss fights in the game, made even better by some changes in Season 9, which made their AI more aggressive, and the flamethrower and lunge attacks have much better tracking, although their health is even lower than the initial nerf to compensate. Not much has really happened outside of this, although Stitchagim became the 6th Ashen Lord in the Herald of the Flame adventure, released in October 2022. Stitchagim became the Herald of the Flame, who had the same attacks as the other Ashen Lords, but summoned phantoms to assist him, and also, Phase 3 included an erupting volcano, not just the World's End attack like the others had. Unfortunately, players can no longer experience this fight as it was removed after just 2 weeks, with the other 11 adventures in 2022 and 2023. Oh, and they were added as the final boss of the Fort Fortune, which was released in April 2021 with the release of Season 2. Outside of these minor changes, the world event has pretty much been untouched. A handful of commendations released with Ashen Winds, focusing on selling the Ashen Winds skulls, defeating each of the 4 Ashen Lords several times, using the Ashen Winds skull, and defeating Ashen Lords just in general. Rewards for these commendations include the Ashen Winds skull sales, which are fantastic. They're such an underrated set and you don't really see them much nowadays. There are also tattoos based on each of the Ashen Lords if you defeat 5 of them each. Ashen Winds brought some other changes to the game, such as a Pirate Emporium refresh, items in the gold shop, and one quite controversial change for a subset of players. Duke was still a good guy at this point in the game, and had a little shop for us to visit to exchange our hard-earned gold and doubloons. The desirables for doubloons continued the Fearless Bonecrusher items, with the equipment being featured. The gold items were the Nightshine Parrot equipment, also being released. And about that controversial change. Before this update released, it was actually possible to shoot players through any surface on the ship, known as wallbanging. And no, get your mind out of the gutter. This was a technique used at a high level of play, allowing players to be shot while concealed behind a hull, mast, or basically any other parts of the ship's geometry. As you can imagine, the removal of this was met with very reasonable criticism and mature thoughts all round. Yeah, right. I get this was supposedly ruining the skill gap, but ultimately, it's unrealistic, unintuitive, and allowed for some stupid plays, like shooting someone through the wall of the sloop as they climb the ladder. Usually, I'm one for keeping in little techs, like harpoon boarding that is only useful at a high level of play, but it just didn't make sense and offered so much jank. But you could still shoot through railings, stairs, and other tiny gaps, something I believe was a good middle ground. See, Rare has been fixing these idiosyncrasies for years, they just took a while to get around to quick swapping. But anyways, overall Ashen Winds was a superb update off the back of another sublime update, and don't forget, this content came out monthly instead of every 3 to 7 months like we have now. I would love to see some embellishment on the Ashen Winds event, be it the inclusion of Stitchagim at Molten Sands Fortress again, as a boosted version of the event, some new attacks or dynamics, like fighting 2 at once, or even just some new commendations. I'd love to see Rare buff the Ashen Winds skull, because as it stands, it's not worth using as a weapon, since it's so weak, and it's not worth losing the gold bonus just for using it. They did make it easier for smaller crews in Season 9, but it needs a bit more to breathe some life into it at this point.